Hello everyone and welcome to my channel, Chess with Daisy. This channel is geared towards beginners and here are my top 5 tips for people that are below 1200 in chess. Tip number 1 is that if you can put your knight on an outpost square, you should probably do it because it's generally going to be a good position for your knight. So good to the point where a rook will even sacrifice itself for the knight if it's on an outpost square on a really good square, such as on the 6th rank, or sometimes even the 5th rank, and especially if it's on the 7th rank. In this position, Black played a terrible blunder, and Black played b5. Now, this is really bad because, for one, Black gives up control of potentially trapping this bishop in the future, but more importantly, it gives up control of the c5 square. Now, when this knight jumps into this outpost square, it attacks both these two pawns at the same time. Black can't save both, so a logical move looks like rook to a8, right? Attacking the bishop. Why would we take a pawn if our bishop is going to get taken? But then the amazing knight takes pawn. And you may say, well, wait a second, we've just blundered our bishop and now we're probably going to lose the game because we're down material. But if you look very closely, when rook takes bishop, come up with a move for white. And I'm sure most of you have seen this instantly. Rook here is checkmate. But if you go back, that wasn't the best move for Black. The best move was actually knight to g4 and rook up. The game moves on. You can choose to take the pawn or you can choose not to take the pawn. But regardless, the knight is just in such a powerful position, I'm sure the evaluation bar will evaluate white as winning. And yes, it's saying that white is up a full rook. Tip number 2 is that you always want your king next to your pawn minority. So this is an endgame example of when the black king is positioned incorrectly. So these are all the top engine moves. White continues to advance and plays g5, and Black's entire plan has to do with going after these pawns that are becoming too advanced. And now once Black goes after all these pawns, it gives White's king an opening to go into Black's territory, in the future maybe even take these two pawns and have an outside pass pawn, which will win the game. So if we go on ahead, you'll see that maybe the best move here is to try and block up the position, but White is eventually going to get through, and Black will have to make a decision of to defend these pawns or to attack these pawns. And either way, Black is going to be losing the game. Tip number 3 is to always be aware of trades and if they're good for you or if they're bad for you. So in this position, White was up 2 pawns, so White decided that it would be a good idea to go into an endgame and trade off everything. So if you look at the evaluation, it evaluated White as up a rook, but as we go on, you'll see as the evaluation bar gets lower and lower, and slowly you'll see, after all these moves, and finally White decided to trade off the queen as well, after all these moves, it becomes almost drawn. With White being slightly better just because White has 2 pawns, but what it really should say is +2, but because this is now an opposite colored bishop's endgame, everyone knows how they can be kind of drawish, and even if the bishop doesn't even take the pawn, the evaluation bar still values it as +1 and not +2, because this endgame is going to be a draw. Tip number 4 is that you want to be careful when castling into a pawn storm, and you should almost never castle into a pawn storm. If I turn on the evaluation, if I go back 1 move, White is totally fine, the position is equal. But once White castles kingside, you'll see that the evaluation goes all the way down, and it even goes to the point where it says that Black is up a rook. So if we fast forward the position, let's see what this is about. Black plays f3, knight goes to g3, and after these 2 captures, there's this beautiful check, and it also attacks this rook, but when the white king moves to the side, the computer engine doesn't even recommend that Black takes the rook just because this knight is so well positioned. So when the knight goes back, we can fast forward the position, and now over here, maybe Black is a little bit nervous. Black might not want to allow this fork, but actually, this is a trap. So White goes ahead and White takes this pawn and says, I dare you, go ahead and do that fork. So White does. And over here, what would you do? So if you're rated under 1200, which is what this video is geared towards, maybe you would take this rook. But if I go ahead and I turn on the evaluation, you'll see that it becomes mate in 8. So in this game, White saw that, and White decided to try as best as White could to delay the checkmate with these bishop moves. But overall, it wasn't enough. And when the rook comes all the way over here, it's too late. There's no way to delay checkmate. And this is checkmate. Tip number 5 is to know your endgames. If you've made it to 1200, I'm sure you've seen this position before and you know that it's a draw. But if you guys are under 1000 or even under 500, you might not have seen this before. So this position is a draw, and black has to know how to draw this, otherwise it's going to be a loss. So if we fast forward, all black has to do is either stay in front of the king or stay in front of the pawn. Either one is fine, and it's going to be a draw in the end. And now if we go back, an even easier way to do this is all black needs to do is just be able to guard the queening square, and black can just dance back and forth on these squares. But if we move this one over, we'll see that the evaluation bar says that it's mate in 43. If we have a rook pawn and it's alone, then that's going to be a draw, but a knight pawn, that's a win. The key to this endgame is you need to get your king to one of these 3 squares before your pawn moves. And if your pawn ever moves, it immediately becomes a draw. Your king has to be controlling these 3 key squares. So if we go over here, what you're going to do is you're going to march your king up until you can guard these 3 key squares. Now in this position, if black could just say, oh, I skipped my turn, that would be great for black because black would end up drawing the game. How else are you going to move this pawn if this king is always blocking? But right now black is in Zig Zwang. So what Zig Zwang is a fancy word for compelled to move. So black has to move in this position even though black doesn't want to, and that gives us the opportunity to play another pawn move. And again, black is Zig Zwanged. So we get to go to this square, and now black has to go over here, and we get to advance our pawn safely because our king is on one of the key squares. So as we go on, in this position, what would you do? So if you said pawn to g6, you are incorrect. This is a draw. You do not want to do that. Instead, what you want to do is you want to just move your king to a good square, and then as it goes on, you don't want to play this, of course, because that loses your pawn. Instead, what you want to do is, again, you're going to need to Zig Zwang your opponent. So what you do is you're going to step back in front of the pawn, and when the king has to move to the side, or let's say the king moves here, then we can move our pawn, we can Zig Zwang him again, and we're going to win like this. And if we go back to the previous position, when the king moves to the side, again, it's easy, and we just win like this. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned something from that. Subscribe if you'd like, and I hope you enjoyed the video.